All right, folks, welcome back to another subsection on research methods. And in this subsection, we're going to be talking all about research ethics. And I'm going to be talking a lot about this. And I'm going to repeat the same point a lot just because it's really, really important, right? Now, the most famous example of unethical research are literal freaking Nazis, right? So back in the 30s and 40s, Nazi Germany performed a heck of a lot of horrible atrocities. One of their many atrocities was doing really, really unethical research on different populations, right? So they had concentration camps with Jewish people and homosexuals and socialists and, all kinds of different people shoved into these horrible slave camps. And they decided to do a lot of truly disturbing and disgusting, especially medical research, but also other kinds of research, using these slaves without their consent, without their ability to say no, because they were, again, essentially slaves in these German concentration camps. As much as I'd love to say that the United States has always been a shining beacon of hope and ethical research and et cetera, I can't say that either, right? There are lots of instances of really unethical research happening here in the United States, and not hundreds of years ago, but within living memory, right? One of the most disturbing was the Tuskegee experiments. And this was, I don't know, I think 50s and 60s, but don't quote me on that. And this is where there were some researchers who really wanted to see what happens to patients who have syphilis when that syphilis goes untreated. So they had this clinic where black men would come in to get health evaluations, and essentially when those patients had syphilis, they just weren't told. And then the researchers were able to watch these men as they slowly, got worse and worse, and in many cases eventually died of syphilis without ever having been told that they have syphilis, and cured, which was, again, a relatively easy thing to do at that point. Within the field of criminal justice, or criminal justice adjacent studies, there are two really famous pieces of research with ethical concerns. Probably the more famous of the two is the Milgram experiments. And once again, this came out of World War II. Stanley Milgram was a psychologist who thought, he looked at all these former Nazi soldiers saying, I was just following orders. And he looked at all the Americans saying, that I would never follow those orders. If somebody in command ordered me to do something truly horrific, like the Nazis did, I would just say no. I would refuse to abide by that. And Milgram was like, but would you? So he designed an experiment to test how obedient to authority people really were. And the way it worked was like this. Two volunteers would kind of come into the experimental area at the same time. And they would be assigned as either a teacher or a learner. At that point, they would be put on opposite sides of a little wall, a little kind of internal room for the learner to sit in, and they'd be strapped to a machine that delivered mild electric shocks, right? And the teacher would sit on the other side of the wall, and he would read word pairs, right? So like, jacket, purple, and then coffee, television, and he'd read off a series of these word pairs. And then he would say the first half of one of those many word pairs that he had read off, and the learner was required to kind of answer with the associated word. And if they failed, if they got the answer wrong, the teacher was supposed to flip a switch to give that person a mild electric shock. And the switches were numbered kind of 1 through 10 or something. and with 1 being the mildest shock, and then going all the way up to 10, which was the most severe shock. So that's, the researcher would stand behind the teacher in a white lab coat with a clipboard, writing things down every once in a while, and they would proceed with this experiment. And of course, the learner would start getting things wrong. So the teacher would shock them. And then harsher and harsher and harsher and harsher. And, the learner would say, like, oh, my heart, I can't do this, I want out. And the researcher would tell the teacher, no, keep going. Keep going. Don't stop. We need to deliver the shocks, right? Now, unbeknownst to the teacher, the learner was an actor. There weren't 2 volunteers for this study per kind of situation. They lied to the person becoming the teacher, and said that it was the learner was also a volunteer just like them, but in reality the learner was an actor. Nobody was actually getting shocked. There were no actual electric shocks that were really delivered by the teacher to the learner. But the teacher didn't know that at the time. So they had to kind of sit there and think they were essentially torturing this poor person on the other side of this wall with these electric shocks. And the real purpose of the experiment was to see how far the teacher would go with these electric shocks with just a researcher standing behind them in a white lab coat and clipboard saying, keep going, don't stop. We need to complete this research. And he found, that most people went all the way up to 10. But this research has been widely cited as unethical and damaging. And there have been lots of reports of the people who participated in this experiment having all kinds of mental and emotional issues afterward, for what I hope are obvious reasons. And then the last one we're going to talk about here is an example. And again, I could talk, there's probably thousands more examples of unethical research I could talk about. But the one that's really most applicable to criminal justice is the Stanford prison experiments. This researcher named Zimbardo, back in the 70s, took a whole bunch of Stanford college students, randomly assigned them to be either prison guards or prisoners, and then had a mock prison built in the basement of one of the Stanford buildings, where they had to kind of play act as prison guards or prisoners, with himself, the researcher Zimbardo, being the warden. And this quickly got really out of hand. It was supposed to last like a week or 2 weeks or something, and it ended up lasting like 3 days. Because one of the graduate students looked up at Zimbardo and said, "You're torturing these kids." Because the prison guards had become sadistic and cruel, and the prisoners had become essentially prisonized in a matter of a couple of days. And this, once again, is very commonly cited as, a bright, shining example of really unethical research. Now, after World War II, we tried, and in most cases convicted, a bunch of high-level German officers and functionaries for doing really horrible things in these concentration camps and in the war in general. Many of them were executed for their role in doing all of the horrible things that were done by the Germans in World War II. One of the things that happened afterward to try to prevent that from ever happening again was the Nuremberg Code. So this is kind of the trials of these Nazi criminals took place at Nuremberg. Thus, this code was named after that. I believe it was also developed in Nuremberg at around the same time and in close proximity to this trial. So it's called the Nuremberg Code. And one of the things that, the kind of the list of the ethical research rules that the Nuremberg Code set down, most of which not for the first time, but very importantly in a very public international agreement kind of way, was research has to be based on voluntary and informed consent, right? You can't force people to volunteer or force people to participate in your research without consenting, and not just consenting, but informed consent. They have to know what they're getting into before they can actually give real, true consent, right? There has to be a high likelihood of positive results. You can't perform any kind of research if nobody really thinks it's going to turn out well. You can't be like, well, there's a 1% chance we could find this really important thing. No. We're not going to put people through this process of being a research subject for such a low probability outcome. It has to be based on previous knowledge. You can't go way outside the realms of previous research, right? We have to take these small steps, because if you jump too far, you risk really damaging people. You have to avoid unnecessary suffering, right? So notice that it's not avoid all suffering, it's avoid unnecessary suffering, right? So if I'm in a medical experiment, and I have to get a shot or an IV, obviously I'm going to suffer because I am not the best with needles. But that's kind of necessary suffering, and it's very minor suffering, right? As much as I hate needles, that's still pretty minor suffering, right? But, if I have a pretty good chance of losing a limb, that's some pretty serious suffering. And if it's not absolutely 100% required to answer this very important research question, they're just not going to do it, right? We need to have trained experimenters. We can't just have anybody who wants to going out there and doing research on humans with no training, no kind of ability to know what they're doing, making all kinds of, rookie mistakes, right? And we need to make it so that subjects can quit at any time, without undue pressure, right? So those people in the Milgram experiment who said like, maybe I shouldn't do this, maybe I shouldn't shock this person, maybe you should check on him. They really needed to be allowed to say, no, I'm leaving, without that undue pressure. Nobody was told they couldn't in the Milgram experiments. Nobody was told they couldn't quit. But there was some pretty heavy pressure put on them to stay and keep going. Now, who gets to determine whether those guidelines are being met or not, or whether the guidelines we're going to talk about in the rest of this section are met or not? The Institutional Review Board. Before anybody does any kind of research on humans or even animals, you need to get the approval of an Institutional Review Board. And this is a group of researchers who essentially sit as an ethics panel. They take everybody's proposed research before they've done any amount of actual research or actual data gathering, and they go over the plan to see whether these ethical guidelines will be met or not. And they are required to approve the research plan before any research can start gathering any data, right? And there's different kind of levels of scrutiny. They're going to give different types of research based on what kind of research it is. So, when I did my dissertation and I was only using secondary data, I wasn't gathering any new information from any people. This data had already been gathered. That researcher had gotten an IRB approval for it. I still had to go through the IRB, but it was a very expedited process. Basically, they just said, you're sure you're not gathering any new data? This data was gathered responsibly. All right, cool, go ahead. And it was super simple and easy. But if I want to do, say, a medical study where I want to try some new drug on children, that's going to have a huge amount of IRB oversight. They're going to take a lot of time and effort to really examine and make sure my research plan is ethical and isn't going to harm other people. All right? Now, when you are a researcher, we need to perform our research in certain ways, right? So even above and beyond all those rules from the Nuremberg Code I just talked about, there are certain ethical rules we have to take and we have to focus on and we have to keep in mind whenever we're doing research, right? Number one, do not become attached to an outcome. I don't care how strongly you feel about the subject. I don't care how much you want some research study to come out a certain way. You have to allow yourself to only follow the data, set out the rules at the beginning, right? And this gets into number two. Do this systematically. Set out the rules at the beginning, have your definitions, have your methods, have your measures, have your analysis plan in place, then perform it according to that plan, and be ready for that process to spit out an answer in direct contradiction to what you thought it would be. But as long as if you don't do it systematically and you start changing your plan halfway through, you could be either consciously or subconsciously artificially nudging your data to try to get the outcome that you had in mind. So don't do that. Number three, document everything. And this is a pretty good rule for lots of areas outside of research methods too. Document everything. Every decision, every conversation, every development of your plan. If you are forced to change your plan halfway through, document exactly how and exactly why and potential impacts and all those things. And then importantly, after you've documented all those things, disclose all those things. We don't keep secrets. Any secrets you keep are bad because probably they're gonna get out. And at that point, once people realize you've hidden something, they're going to not only completely reject that piece of research, they're probably going to reject and not pay attention to and refuse to publish any other research you have ever done or will ever do. So disclose everything. Number four, clarify your assumptions. Every piece of research has some kind of assumption. Whether it's, a new law requiring police to arrest domestic violence abusers actually results in police arresting all of the domestic abusers they have evidence for, or, that's an assumption. We might assume that car crashes where one of the people had a blood alcohol content above 0.08 was the fault of the person with the blood alcohol content above 0.08. That might be one of the assumptions of our research. But that's an assumption, right? So we have to clarify those assumptions. And the vast majority of the time, those assumptions are going to be correct assumptions. But we still need to list them and disclose them and clarify them because they won't always be, right? Number five, specify the meaning of all terms. And this goes back to our definitions, right? Remember, what is a sandwich? Well, we need to clearly and explicitly define all of our terms and then make that clear in our publication, whether we're making a paper or a conference presentation or writing a book. We need to make sure our working definitions of all those terms are included. Number six, be skeptical. But remember, skeptical, not denialist. We need to be skeptical of everything and everybody. We need to kind of ask for evidence for everything. Number seven, replicate. Don't just do anything once. Don't answer any research question once. Whether it's you or somebody else, somebody needs to attempt to answer it multiple times in slightly different ways to really get a good answer about anything. Number eight, study theory. Because if you don't know criminology and crim theory, or whatever theory in your particular field, if it's not criminal justice, you won't be able to guide your research based on that theory. And then number 9, search for patterns. Patterns are everything. The good news is the human brain is really, really, really efficient at recognizing patterns. So try to recognize those patterns, search them out, and find them wherever and whenever you can. Honesty and openness is absolutely imperative. Make sure that you don't lie and you don't hide anything. Right? We talked about this on the last slide. Don't lie, don't hide anything. Because if you do either of those two, you're going to get caught, and there goes your career, there goes all your research. Now it will be as if you had never done any of that work that you spent all that time and energy and money to do. Make sure your implementation plan is according to your plan. So you made this plan at the beginning. When you implement it, make sure it's being implemented the way you thought it would, the way you planned it to be implemented. Because a lot of times we'll have our plan, we'll go to data gathering, and we'll just kind of assume that the way the data was gathered is the exact same way it was planned to be gathered, but then it turns out it wasn't, right? So if you have to hire a bunch of people to do interviews, make sure each one of those people doing the interviews is doing the interview in the same way. Make sure they all know the rules. Make sure they all know the plan. Because you might have one interviewer who decides to kind of go rogue and ask questions that weren't on the list and, do something that they weren't supposed to do. And that's going to make their one piece of data kind of incompatible with the results from all the other interviewers, right? And then, of course, one thing we really, really, really have to focus on as social scientists is the fact that we have people as subjects. Right? Physicists don't often have to deal with this. Veterinarians have to deal with, animals as subjects, but that's slightly different than people as subjects. So if you're using people as subjects, that's difficult. That has a lot of extra problems associated with it. Especially if you're doing something like a true experiment that involves any kind of risk of either physical or emotional damage. If it's just a simple like pen and paper survey, we still have to be careful, but it's not quite at that same level. But all of that is up to the IRB. Follow their guidelines, follow their rules, follow their process for gathering data about people. And one of the things they're going to tell you is that there are certain populations that have extra protections over and above what you or I might have because of ethics. Now, in medical science, a lot of the protected subjects are things like pregnant women. They get extra ethical protections because they're pregnant, right? In criminal justice, the ones we deal with the most are minors, i.e. people under 18. They have a lot of extra protections that the IRB will have to kind of verify. But the other big one is prisoners. And prisoners have these extra protections because it is very difficult for them to truly consent, right? One of the things I love about the 21st century is we're doing a much better job at teaching young people, especially young men, what consent really means. And of course, we're doing that in more of a sexual relationship context. But it applies just as well in a lot of other areas, like this, right? Young men today know a heck of a lot more, nowhere near perfect, but they know a lot more about consent and how it works and why it's important and how to get it, how to verify it's there, than 20, 30, 40 years ago. Prisoners need to capital C consent to being a research subject, just like any person needs to consent to a sexual relationship. The problem is it's much more difficult for prisoners to consent to researchers than it would be for, say, you or I to consent to researchers. Because the prison environment kind of is designed around removing the prisoner's consent for anything. What to eat, when to shower, when to go to bed, who to live with. All of their ability to consent to all of that stuff is taken away. That's kind of the nature of prison, right? You do what you're told when you're told. So because they're in this environment and have been for who knows how long, months, years, decades, they get some kind of extra protections surrounding their ability to consent because they're in this specialized circumstance. And then importantly, when you have people as subjects, you need to do what's called a debriefing. So after they're done being a subject in your study, you need to give them something. Some kind of, hey, thank you for participating. Here's all the, we gathered a ton of this data. Here's how we're hoping to use it. Here's where you might find it being published in the future. This is our goal is to cure cancer. Our goal is to, reduce crime in the state of Washington or whatever, right? But they need to have this kind of ability to see how their participation helped. They need to see what their participation and the data that was gathered from them, like how that's being used, what it might accomplish. All those kind of debriefing processes is really important. And if you did an in-person, people as subjects, an actual experiment, not just, like a pen and paper internet survey, you need to sit down with them at the end of the process and as part of this debriefing, ask them, okay, what went wrong? What went right? Are you, do you feel like any of this has hurt you in any way? Are you physically okay? Do you need us to call a doctor for you? Are you mentally okay? Has this traumatized you? All those kinds of things. Now, this is another set of ethical rules I found in a different source. So this is kind of the same thing as or similar to the Nuremberg Code and those earlier ethical rules, just very similar information packaged in a slightly different way. But here, this set of ethical rules says, number one, no harm. Right? And again, sticking Kevin with a needle might technically count as a harm, but if it's a necessary harm for me to be involved in a drug trial that's very important, that is, acceptable. But no undue harm, right? No hurting people just to hurt people for a relatively minor benefit, right? 2, voluntary participation and informed consent. Informed consent, those 2 words are probably the 2 most important words in research methods. Informed consent. People have to know what they're consenting to, and then knowing what the possibilities are, they have to then freely and without being pressured agree to do it, right? Number 3, full disclosure of researcher identity. Don't try to be somebody you're not. Tell them who you are, what your title is, what organization you're involved in, where you're getting funding, all those things. Don't try to hide anything about who you are as a researcher. Number 4, anonymity and confidentiality. If you promise them, stick to that. Okay? And there's a difference. Anonymity means the researcher has no idea who the heck the participants are, right? And this is semi-often used in things like cybercrime, right? If I want to do an interview with a cyber criminal, I may only know him by his online handle or his chat room name, right? I will have no idea what his actual first name and last name or even physical location are, right? He might tell me, oh, I'm somewhere in the state of Florida. But A, that's pretty vague, and B, that's, not necessarily true. He could be lying. But that's anonymity, where even the researcher doesn't know who the research subjects are. Confidentiality, which is much more common, is equally as important. That's where the researcher knows who the participants are, but they promise not to tell anybody else who the participants are, right? So if I do a bunch of interviews with former criminals about, whether they ever commit more crimes or not, and I promise them confidentiality, i.e., I know who you are, but I promise nobody else will ever know that it was you that helped participate in my study and, help me generate this data. You need to abide by those. If you promise anonymity and you accidentally find out who that person is somehow, A, don't try to find out who they are, and B, never ever disclose that. And with confidentiality, if you promise confidentiality, make sure you can deliver. Because if I do an interview with somebody and they tell me something and I'm like, oh, that's a great quote, I really want to use that line in my published paper. But then I realize that if I use that line, anybody who knows anything about that person is going to be able to say, oh, that's him. And break that confidentiality. And now anybody who knows him that read that line now knows that he was one of my participants. Don't do it. You can't do it. If you promise anonymity or confidentiality, you have to really, really, really work to make sure that those things remain anonymous or confidential. And then finally, the benefits should outweigh the costs. And the cost not just being monetary, right? If I'm in a drug trial, one of the costs is I'm going to have to get stuck with needles. That's going to be a cost to me. A very minor one, but a cost to me. So the possible benefits of this research needs to be much larger than the costs incurred on the research subjects and the researcher, both in money and time and physical pain, emotional pain, any of those things. So we really need to make sure that the reasonable results of this research are worth even the minorest of harms. All right, so I wanted to end with these two things. Number one, deception. And we're going to talk more about this in a later section, but deception is a really tough thing. So you'll recall when I talked about the Milgram experiments earlier, part of that research required the teacher to be lied to. It required them to not know that the learner was just an actor, right? And that deception is really, really, really difficult ethically, because occasionally it is in fact required to get accurate data. But once again, you have to look at that benefits outweighing the cost thing. And in the Milgram experiments, many people, if not most people, would argue that the benefits did not outweigh the costs of that deception, and that deception should not have happened. Even if it was required to answer the research question, it was required to have the teacher deceived as to the nature of the learner. The benefits didn't outweigh that deception, didn't kind of justify that deception, and thus the research just shouldn't have happened at all. Right? But there are other times where deception is required, and it is kind of an important thing for a piece of research to answer a particular research question. One of my favorite examples of this was back in the 60s. I've been really bad with dates for this section. When they were building the World Trade Centers, they were going to be the tallest buildings in the world at the time. They were using these very new construction techniques, and they knew that they wanted to have a big observation deck up on the roof or the top floor, or right at the top, right? But what they were worried about is wind, because buildings are designed to flex a little bit in the wind, right? And being up at the very top of the world's tallest building, even a little bit of wind causing the building to vibrate just a little bit would cause that observation deck to sway pretty good. And so the question was, how much sway did it take before people started kind of A, noticing, and B, kind of getting nauseated, getting that kind of seasick feeling, because they needed to know how high or at what rate the winds should blow before the directors of the World Trade Center should shut down the observation deck and get all the tourists and everybody, down off the building. So if they just told people, hey, we're going to put you in this vibrating room and you tell us when you notice it and when you get nauseated, that's not going to give you an accurate answer, right? That's not going to tell you how people actually respond in that kind of situation, because people are going to be thinking about it. They're going to, the more they know about that situation, the less they're going to be able to give a really accurate answer. So they came up with a research study that involved deception in order to really definitively answer this research question. And what they did was they got people in for research, but they told them it was about eye health, and they gave everybody a free eye exam, right? So you participate in this research, we'll give you a free eye exam. And they didn't tell them about the swaying bit. But what they did was they built a special room in the doctor's office with all the eye exam stuff in it. And they built it specially so that they could make that room sway just like they had calculated the top of the World Trade Center was going to sway at different levels of wind. And then the research subjects came in and they got their free eye exam, and some of them got only a tiny amount of sway, some of them got more. And they noticed how much of that sway they needed before people, again, A, noticed, B, became uncomfortable, right? And that involved deception, but it was required to get accurate answers, and it was judged that the benefits outweighed the harms because A, there was a doctor right there, B, they did get a free eye exam, C, there was no kind of danger of actual injury. It was, the absolute worst case scenario, somebody gets a little seasick. So there are some cases where deception is kind of approved. But again, it takes a lot for the IRB to approve that kind of thing. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is the selective distribution of benefits. And this can be rough because any given population, you're going to pull a sample out, and we're going to talk more about sampling in a future section. But you're going to pull this sample out. And then a lot of times, the nature of the experiment involves giving them something good. Job training for prisoners, right? But that means that the people who aren't in your sample aren't getting that benefit. And there are ethical issues there, right? And there are going to be we're going to talk again in later sections about how we can kind of minimize the harms here. But think about like a cancer drug. All right, I've got this new drug that I really think is going to do a lot to cure cancer. So I get 1,000 people with that kind of cancer and divide them up 500 and 500. One group gets the new miracle drug, one group gets a placebo. But is that really fair? Like 500 people, we're giving just a sugar pill? We're saying, hey, this drug is hopefully really going to help you. And then it does nothing as this cancer eats away at their bodies? So this is a serious kind of problem, right? Whether it's about giving job training to prisoners but not others, or some drug to patients for some disease. Some people are going to be kind of haves, and some people are going to be have-nots. And so there's lots of different ethical issues and ethical concerns with that. Hopefully we're going to be talking a little bit more about possible solutions to that selective distribution of benefit problem in a future section. But for now, that's been a really long section. I am tired. It takes a surprising amount of work and effort and energy to record these. So if you're still watching, I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.